Greetings, I'm Professor Luchin, and this is Module 1 or Lecture 1 for Environmental and Safety Management, Safety 783. I found that I needed to redesign all of my modules, all my lectures, because of the change in the format for summer 2020. So please bear with me. This obviously is not campus and the high quality studio and the high quality editing that we get. This is me in my office in my home with the equipment that I have here. And so please just bear with me, give me a little time to adjust. So here are the basic objectives for this lecture. I like to start more from a historical perspective. That's just me. It's something I'm interested in. It's something that over my career, as I've studied safety, I find it more interesting if I find out not only who they are, but what their background is when I'm hearing someone speak or reading someone's work. So I'm going to kind of give you a sort of a broad swath of things that are interesting to me that I think had probably the most impact. So let's go way, way, way back. And I'm going to cover this very lightly because I have several interesting YouTube videos that I've provided to you. I provided one that I think is like 3.5 minutes. One's a little bit longer, 12 minutes, gets into the hygiene of the time. And then there's a BBC documentary, which is about 51 minutes. I don't expect you to watch that unless you're really interested and you're curious and you happen to have the time to burn. I'm also going to ask you to watch a 50-minute documentary on the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So each week I'm going to try to provide you everything that I find really interesting, but the time you have to dedicate to it may vary, and just talk to me about it. I just want to make sure that you're at least consuming some of it and you kind of understand the gist. Back to the story, and that is, what was work like pre-industrial revolution? Because what we're going to find is the industrial revolution completely changed not only society, but more specifically how people work, what sort of trades they could go into. And recently I was on a recording for a podcast, and we really got into a long discussion about the safety profession. And are we truly a profession like law or medicine, in which there is a body of knowledge and a person goes to school, it's an accredited program, you earn a degree, and then you have to sit for an exam, which is a licensed exam, an accredited exam, and then once you've completed that, you adopt their ethical code, and you have to go through continuous education, continued ed, in order to earn credits, in order to maintain that license so you can practice. Do we have that in safety? It's not regulated by law like it does for engineering law, medicine. There's other sovereign professions that have those things. We have the Board of Certified Safety Professionals, but we are going back to how people made a living back then. And it was very much parsed out. It was more localized to where people lived. And there weren't heavy populated or densely populated areas, unless there was unless there was real need for it. Maybe there was a body of water or particular land formation that gave to multiple people working. But you're either a skilled craftsman or tradesman, a farmer or laborer, or you were really rich and people worked for you. And what was interesting was the work back then, safety was built into it. It's integrated into the work itself. It was part of the practice or part of the craft. So that, and the way you learned it is that you were an apprentice. So in an apprenticeship, you had a master, so like a master craftsman that would teach you. And you may work up to a mid thing called the journeyman. The journeyman can practice their craft, but they don't have the skill level, the experience level, in order to mentor an apprentice. And so a journeyman would still receive instruction and guidance from a master craftsman. And that's how it went. So usually kids adopted the profession of their parent. So it was integrated into it. Along came the Industrial Revolution, mechanized power, and mass production. Because of the plants that were built to foster this mechanized work, people tried to live close to it, and so that's where we came up with the densely populated cities, because it was around a focal point, which would be the industry, the work they were doing. People no longer had to work years and years for very little pay as an apprentice to work up to a journeyman to have their own living. Now they could go in unskilled, uneducated, and they were taught to just do one part of a job or one set of tasks. And so that it did give birth to engineers. There were much more engineers that were designing and maintaining the mechanized work, the machines themselves. But it was very dangerous. They didn't have any sort of background of understanding of how to design it to be safe or to be healthy, because that was integrated into the work prior to that. Now, the first person who's actually I'd like to speak to, and this is Frederick Taylor. He was considered the father of industrial engineering. He was the first person to bring a stopwatch into a workplace in time and break down someone's work into simple tasks. And he would evaluate how much movement or time was wasted. And so what he was trying to do is optimize production, optimize the performance of the worker. The issue is, and you'll be reading a little bit about Taylor, is that he viewed the worker as a beast of burden. And what I mean by that is he would whip people so they would work harder. He felt that people are only driven by money, and if you throw more money at them, they'll work themselves the way they should. If you don't have that, people are really lazy, and they'll do something called soldiering, and that is to look busy but not working even near your capacity, because, well, why, And so you'll read a little bit about scientific management, which we still see today. Ford, who had ran and built Ford Motor Company, adopted a lot of Taylor's techniques, and that led to the invention of the assembly line. What happens when you consider workers just a cog in a machine or a beast of burden, and you don't really trust them? Well, you have something like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And this was a disaster, but something good came out of it. And that is public outcry for workplace safety conditions allowed the National Safety Council to come about, the American Society of Safety, now professionals, used to be engineers, to come out, and also the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association. So even though it was horrible, and it'd be great if you could watch the PBS Frontline documentary. It is very powerful. If you're working in safety and you haven't seen it or you haven't studied this event, you really need to, because it kind of sets a baseline for the regulation and the emphasis here in the U.S. on safety. Shortly thereafter, Herbert William Heinrich, and you've probably heard of the term Heinrich if you've been in safety for a while, was an engineer. And he was working his way up and got into insurance. His book, Industrial Accident Prevention, was kind of the first textbook that was written about occupational safety. And it's been updated. New editions have come out. I do have this book. Dan Petersen contributed to it. I'll talk to him in a moment. And just a few of the things that came out of it were the 10 axioms of safety, download theory. You've already read all this. But unfortunately, his work has been somewhat misconstrued, and probably the leader, the general of that attack, is Fred Manuel. Now, Fred Manuel has given us a lot of great research or work as well. He wrote on the practice of safety. He still he doesn't publish as much as he used to. I think he's in his mid-90s now. He's an ASSP fellow. The guy has contributed a lot. Now, even though I always try to look for the positive in everything, and I appreciate everything he's done. He is an engineer. He's got the professional engineering designation. And when I've read his work, he sometimes, in order to justify a point, he proposes a theoretical conversation between people. That's not a valid way to make your point. I know he's trying to demonstrate, but it's not real. It's not even anecdotal. He'll also write a lot in, I call it PowerPoint, but he writes a lot of bulleted lists when he writes. So whenever I was reviewing manuscripts, I could tell it was a Manuel manuscript simply by the way it was written. I think he's overly critical of Heinrich. And later in the course, I'll get into it a little bit more, but Heinrich, that was, early 1900s. What he gave us, you have to kind of read his chapters. So like the pyramid, where for every 330 exposures, 1 is very serious, including death, 29 are minor, and 300 are near miss. a lot of people, even today, the people who are in the camp of serious injury fatalities, and they say that an exposure that leads to serious injury or fatality is not the same as a near miss. And they believe that the Bureau of Labor Statistics data support that. I'll show you my work on this. I don't. Sure, of course, if you're working unsafely and you're not tied off on a 10-story building on an open edge and you fall off, there's going to be no near miss. And in the same regard, a lot of the little things we do in ergonomics, the resulting wouldn't even be a visit to the doctor. But I think a great majority of exposures, I believe severity is more dictated by inches and seconds or by chance than it is anything else. And for all of the injury reports and work comp data that I've analyzed, I tend to see that a great majority of, the thing that's the most frequent has a few really expensive claims. It seems to go hand in hand that way. There are some vehicular accidents that don't have near miss or really bad, and they're very few, far in between. But so I think Fred was a little bit overcritical of the pyramid, and I think he also gets into the ratios of things, which, admittedly, Heinrich's work suffered from attribution error. Didn't really know about confirmation bias and things like that back then. That didn't come out until the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s. So he erroneously assigned certain things on ratios. And the domino theory, even though that isn't really a supported concept, it was the first unilateral model of an accident. And I think by manipulating it, moving things around, it gives us a better picture. So I think he did contribute, even though we wouldn't use it today. I'm going to have you read Fred's critique of Heinrich, and we will talk about that. And here's the basic debate here. The ratio of severity, what's the primary cause of accidents? Is it unsafe acts, unsafe conditions? And what does that mean for us? So we're going to shift gears here a little bit, and now we're going to move up to, I'm referring to modern day here, but I'm going to explain where this is. You may have heard of injury and illness prevention programs through OSHA. It used to be in the front burner. They were going to pass a law that every company, every business would have to create this program that details how they're going to go about continuously evaluating the workplace for hazards and risks, come up with solutions, evaluate those solutions, track training, a continuous improvement. But it fell to the wayside. Again, it is based off of the Safety and Health Program Voluntary Guidelines. This is a 1989 document. It was something I was trained to use when I was a compliance officer with OSHA in Minnesota. And I have here the 6 primary elements that's from this document. You've probably seen these before: management commitment, employee involvement, hazard identification and assessment, hazard prevention control, safety and health training, and then finally periodic evaluation. We can add some more to those, and I will get into that later in the semester. But the question is, where did OSHA get this stuff from? Where did these concepts come from? And when I was in grad school, I had the luxury of looking this stuff up, and I spent a lot of time. And the earliest I could find was really this Davis and Stahl. And this came from looking at the bibliography of things that were published in the 80s and 90s. So Davis and Stahl, what they did is they just evaluated, they call it, even the authors know the study disclosed no magic formula, no silver bullet, or even distinct pattern, but noted some common features. So they were evaluating award-winning companies. And sure, it's like, okay, these are some, let me give you an example. So here's some successful people. What do they do? And if I was to do those things, would I be successful too? And anecdotally, maybe, yeah, if you do these things. But the problem is, it doesn't capture everything. And can any business see what the successful businesses do, mimic it, and then become successful? Not likely, probably not. There are a lot of other factors, confounding variables, that would have to align in order for you to do that. And so even though it's interesting what they came up with, it's not valid or reliable. It's just interesting. And so you can just read these. These were some of their observations. But you see some things here. It talks about management employees. It talks about elimination of hazards, pride. That was the term they used. well-organized safety department, eagerness to discuss safety matters, acceptance of frontline supervisors, a safety director. So they were trying. In 67, Planick et al. Did a study, but this was a perception survey of people who attended a conference. So these are people who are practicing. It's like, what's your opinion? So there are 8 areas, that were ranked. And number 1, interestingly, supervisory participation. I agree with that. Number 2, top management participation. 3, engineering inspection. You're probably reading these as I go. All the way down, number 8, motivational educational techniques. So that was interesting. And then, but it was just, again, it's an opinion. So then this group of NIOSH researchers really tried to study it. And what they did is, now, ideally, research is experimental design, where it's, precondition an exposure or a treatment, and then a post measure, and you can see what relates. So, but what they did is they paired companies that were generally from the same area, generally the same size, so generally identical, but one had a high accident rate, one had a low accident rate, and then they compared to see what was the difference. Now, this is a little bit more valid than the previous 2, and here are some of the things they found. And it was, management commitment, basically. It was an overall consciousness of safety in the workers, different types of promotional or incentive techniques, better job specialization in safety training, more humanistic approach to disciplining, more frequent, less formal inspections, safety program emphasizing a balance between engineering and non-engineering approaches. That's cool. And a stable workforce is what they found. So I'm going to have you read there was a series of 3 publications from that NIOSH study. The one that is more consumable is the one that was published in 1978 in the Journal of Safety Research. But then I want you to read what would be considered almost a pre-effort. And actually what got him the job was M.J. Smith. That's Michael James Smith. He was my advisor, my mentor in graduate school. In 1971, his faculty advisor called him and a few of his classmates in to do this inspection effectiveness report. This was pre-OSHA. So OSHA was going to become something, and there were several states, several research institutions that were asked, is OSHA really going to be effective? And so I want you to read his inspection report. The whole thing, and you can actually see that it's been typed, which is crazy. But I want you to read through mostly just the abstract. What did they find from it? Because it's really interesting what their results were. Now, it'd be remiss of me not to mention Dr. Dan Petersen. He had an enormous influence on the safety field. Notice his background is organizational behavior and management. It seems like these psychologists, sociologists, organizational behavioralists have made the biggest contribution to our field. Fred Manuel from an engineering perspective, Heinrich from an engineering perspective, but because you can't reduce safety down to just the design of a job. It involves more social aspects, more behavioral aspects, and I think that's why their contributions have always been so well respected and accepted. I've read a lot of his work. I got a lot of his books. I've got Heinrich books. I've got Drucker books. I've got all kinds of books over my shoulder here. I see a lot of agreement between Petersen and Drucker. If I was to choose a textbook for a management class, it would probably be a Petersen book. Though there are some newer guys that and gals that I really, really like, and I would probably borrow from them as well. The first concept of a safety culture survey was the Minnesota Perception Survey with Chuck Bailey. I actually got to meet Chuck when I was working up in Duluth. He had no interest of coming in and meeting my students. I don't know why. But what's interesting, the perception survey was like 100 questions, and way too many. Too much. I mean, back then they didn't have the computers that could run certain statistics, and it would have probably eliminated 80 to 90% of the questions. There's probably just a few that really hit. So I'm sorry I went so long here. I don't want my lectures to be this long. I've got 3 reflection questions I want you to be thinking about as you go and start watching the other videos, reading the assigned text, watching my summary videos of some of the readings as well to try to make things easier for you, so maybe you have more time to watch the videos. And also bring to the discussion board or the live WebEx, in which we'll get together and debate and talk about things. So this first one, and I tried to highlight the words that are really important to me. So I do want you to think about the birth of the occupational safety and health field from the creation of industry plants due to the Industrial Revolution. Next is I want you to think about the context of safety in work. And that's what I'm really trying to build it from. That if you come in just focusing on safety, 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 you're going to miss the mark probably 99.9% of the time. It's the work. So the context of work and the worker. And we're going to build out from that basic premise to organizational influences, societal influences, psychological, sociological, all that kind of stuff. But we're starting very simple with work, okay? And the last one has to do, I want you to look at the articles, primarily the ones that I had mentioned Smith had published, and I want you to think of the limitations of what they found. I don't want you to take what a study says by face value, more importantly now than ever, because sometimes things may sound, that sounds right, but it lacks face validity, it lacks reliability in how the measures were collected, and even the measures are a little bit screwy. And so it's really important to start to develop a sort of cautious approach. And that is to consider what we don't know. Just because it feels right, gut check, feels right, sounds right, or I can think of an instance that I did something or experienced something and it seems to fit that, but does it fit everything? Are there other variables to be thinking about? And that's why I brought up this, what sort of limitations or barriers are existing? And I really want you to start thinking about that. I'll be challenging you to talk about that, to think about that this week and as we go through the semester. So every week, I hope to come back to what we don't know, and I hope to really draw that out of you through the discussion board, or I hope a lot of you can attend the live WebEx where we're going to debate and discuss things. So I'll see you there.